The autumn leaves crackled beneath Margaret Chen's feet as she walked up the cobblestone path to her son David's colonial-style home in suburban Minneapolis. The October air carried the scent of burning firewood from neighboring chimneys, and the golden hour light cast long shadows across the manicured lawn that her daughter-in-law Jessica had spent months perfecting. Margaret paused at the front door, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck, a gift from her late husband that she wore to every important family gathering. Through the large picture window, she could see the warm glow of the dining room chandelier and figures moving about, preparing for what Jessica had called a very special family dinner. The invitation had come 3 weeks ago, delivered not by phone call or text, but by a handwritten card on expensive cream-colored stationery. "Dear Margaret," it had read in Jessica's perfect cursive, "David and I would be honored to have you join us for dinner on October 15th at 6 p.m. Please come, as there's something important we'd like to share with the family. With love, Jessica and David." Margaret had found the formality both touching and slightly puzzling. In the 5 years since David married Jessica, their relationship had been cordial but distant. Jessica, with her marketing degree from Northwestern and her Pinterest-perfect home decorating skills, seemed to inhabit a world that Margaret, a retired high school English teacher, found beautiful but somehow foreign. Before we get into the video, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The front door opened before Margaret could ring the bell. David stood there, his face bright with excitement, wearing the navy sweater she'd knitted him last Christmas. At 32, he still had the same eager smile that had gotten him out of trouble as a boy. "Mom, you're right on time," David said, wrapping her in a warm hug that smelled like the cologne Jessica had given him. Come in. Jessica's been cooking all day." As Margaret stepped into the foyer, she was struck by how the house seemed to sparkle. Every surface gleamed. Fresh flowers adorned every table, and the scent of roasted herbs filled the air. This was clearly more than just a casual family dinner. "Margaret!" Jessica appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron that somehow managed to look elegant rather than functional. Her blonde hair was styled in loose waves, and she wore a burgundy dress that complemented the fall decorations perfectly. "I'm so glad you could make it. You look lovely." Margaret accepted Jessica's brief hug, noting how her daughter-in-law's perfume, something expensive and floral, seemed to linger in the air. "Thank you for inviting me, dear. The house looks beautiful as always." "Oh, this old place," Jessica said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "David helped me move some furniture around this afternoon. We wanted everything to be perfect for tonight." David's arm found its way around Jessica's waist, and Margaret noticed how his wife seemed to lean into him slightly, as if drawing strength from his presence. There was definitely something significant about this evening, though Margaret couldn't quite put her finger on what it might be. "Is Diane coming?" Margaret asked, referring to Jessica's mother, whom she'd met only a handful of times at weddings and holiday gatherings. Diane Hoffman lived in Chicago, about 6 hours away, and worked as a real estate agent for high-end properties. "Actually, yes," Jessica said, her voice brightening. She drove up this morning. She's upstairs freshening up. She should be down any minute." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness. While she'd always been polite with Diane, their conversations had never progressed beyond surface-level pleasantries. Diane had a way of discussing her successful career and extensive travels that left Margaret feeling somewhat inadequate, though she tried not to let it show. "That's wonderful," Margaret said, and meant it. "It'll be nice to spend more time with her." The sound of heels on hardwood announced Diane's arrival. She descended the staircase like an actress making an entrance, her silver hair styled in a chic bob, wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pension check. At 58, Diane maintained the kind of polished appearance that came from regular spa treatments and a personal trainer. "Margaret, how lovely to see you again," Diane said, extending her arms for an air-kiss greeting that left Margaret feeling slightly off balance. "You look wonderful," That scarf is stunning." "Thank you," Margaret replied, touching the silk unconsciously. "It was my husband's last gift to me." For a moment, Diane's practiced smile softened into something more genuine. He had excellent taste. "I remember Robert from David and Jessica's wedding. Such a kind man." The mention of her late husband brought a familiar ache to Margaret's chest, but also a warmth. Robert had been gone for 2 years now, and while the sharp edge of grief had dulled, moments like these still caught her off guard. "Shall we move to the living room?" Jessica suggested, clearly eager to keep the evening moving forward. "I've prepared some appetizers, and David opened a bottle of that wine you brought us from your trip to Napa, Diane." As they settled into the living room, Margaret took in the carefully arranged scene. The coffee table held an array of elegant hors d'oeuvres, smoked salmon canapés, stuffed mushrooms, and what looked like homemade bruschetta. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and candles flickered from various corners of the room. David poured wine for the adults while Jessica bustled about, ensuring everyone had napkins and small plates. Margaret accepted a glass of the deep red wine, noting its rich aroma and wondering how much a bottle like this might cost. "This wine is exceptional, Diane," Margaret said after taking a sip. "You clearly know your vintages." Diane settled back into the leather armchair with practiced grace. "I've been fortunate to travel quite a bit for work. Last month I was in Tuscany with clients who were looking at vineyards. We toured several wineries, and I couldn't resist bringing a few bottles back." As Diane launched into a story about her Italian adventure, Margaret found herself studying the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. There were pictures from David and Jessica's wedding, vacation shots from various exotic locations, and professional photos that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. What struck Margaret was how few photos included her. She appeared in the wedding pictures, of course, and in one family Christmas photo, but most of the images featured David and Jessica with Diane, or Jessica with her college friends, or the young couple at various upscale events and locations. It wasn't that Margaret felt deliberately excluded exactly. It was more that she seemed to exist in the margins of their curated life, appearing for major holidays and significant milestones, but not part of the day-to-day fabric of their experiences. "The food smells incredible, Jessica," Margaret said, redirecting her attention to the conversation. "What are we having?" Jessica's face lit up with pride. "I made herb-crusted rack of lamb with roasted vegetables and a wine reduction sauce. And for dessert, I attempted creme brulee, though I'm not sure how it turned out." "It sounds wonderful," Margaret said. "You've become such an accomplished cook." "Jessica's been taking classes at that culinary school downtown," David added, his pride evident. "She's gotten really serious about it lately." "It's been so fulfilling," Jessica agreed. "I've been thinking about maybe doing something more with it, professionally, but we'll see." Margaret sensed there was more to this story, but before she could ask, Jessica stood up abruptly. "I should check on the lamb. David, could you help me in the kitchen for just a moment?" As the young couple disappeared into the kitchen, Margaret found herself alone with Diane. The older woman studied her with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail. "It's nice that Jessica is pursuing her passions," Diane said, swirling her wine thoughtfully. "She's always been someone who needs a creative outlet. Even as a child, she was constantly starting new projects." "David mentioned she'd been taking cooking classes," Margaret replied. "It sounds like something she really enjoys." "Oh, it's more than that," Diane said, her voice carrying a note that Margaret couldn't quite interpret. "Jessica has some very exciting plans. I'm sure she'll share them with you soon." Before Margaret could ask what she meant, the sound of urgent whispers drifted from the kitchen. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone suggested some kind of disagreement or nervous discussion between David and Jessica. "Young couples," Diane said with a knowing smile, "always something to work out. I remember when Jessica's father and I were their age. Everything seemed so monumentally important." Margaret nodded, though she found herself wondering about the whispered conversation in the kitchen. In her experience, when people whispered during family gatherings, It usually meant there was news, either very good or potentially problematic. David and Jessica returned a few minutes later, both wearing bright smiles that seemed slightly forced. Jessica carried a tray with fresh appetizers, while David refilled their wine glasses. "Everything all right?" Margaret asked. "Perfect," Jessica said quickly. "Just coordinating timing for dinner. I want everything to be just right." As they continued their conversation, Margaret noticed subtle things. The way Jessica's hand occasionally fluttered to her stomach, how David kept glancing at his wife as if checking for some kind of signal, the fact that Jessica was nursing her wine rather than drinking it, despite having praised its quality. And then there was Diane, who seemed to be watching everything with the keen attention of someone who already knew what was coming. By the time Jessica announced that dinner was ready, Margaret had formed a theory about the evening's purpose. The formal invitation, the elaborate meal, the careful staging, it all pointed to an announcement. Most likely, given Jessica's subtle gestures and the way David couldn't seem to stop smiling, they were going to announce a pregnancy. The dining room had been transformed into something from a magazine. Fine china that Margaret recognized as Jessica's grandmother's set gleamed in the candlelight. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead. Cloth napkins were folded into elegant shapes beside each place setting. Margaret noticed that her place card was positioned between David and Diane, while Jessica sat across from her with an empty chair to Jessica's right that Margaret assumed was meant for David. As they took their seats, Jessica disappeared into the kitchen one more time, returning with a beautiful platter holding the herb-crusted lamb, surrounded by colorful roasted vegetables. The presentation was restaurant quality, and Margaret felt a surge of pride for her daughter-in-law's obvious talent. "This looks absolutely incredible, Jessica," Margaret said. "You've outdone yourself." David carved the lamb with practiced skill, while Jessica served the vegetables and drizzled the wine reduction sauce over each plate. Everything moved with choreographed precision, as if they'd rehearsed this moment. "Before we eat," David said, raising his wine glass, "Jessica and I wanted to thank you both for being here tonight. Family means everything to us, and we're so grateful to have you in our lives." Margaret raised her glass, noting again that Jessica barely touched hers to her lips. The theory about a pregnancy announcement seemed more and more likely. As they began eating, the conversation flowed easily. Diane shared more stories from her recent travels. David talked about a promotion opportunity at his architecture firm, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the warm atmosphere. The lamb was perfectly cooked, tender and flavorful. The vegetables were roasted to perfection, and the wine sauce added a sophisticated touch that elevated the entire meal. Margaret made a mental note to ask Jessica for the recipe, though she doubted she'd ever attempt something so elaborate in her own small apartment. "Margaret, how is your book club going?" Jessica asked. "David mentioned you were reading some fascinating novels." "Oh, it's wonderful," Margaret replied, pleased that Jessica had remembered. "We just finished The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Such a compelling story about family secrets and the complexity of relationships." "I loved that book," Diane interjected. "The way it explored how people present different versions of themselves to the world really resonated with me." As the conversation continued, Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the evening. Perhaps she'd been overthinking her relationship with Jessica. Her daughter-in-law was clearly making an effort to create meaningful family connections. It was as they were finishing the main course that Jessica excused herself to prepare dessert. Margaret offered to help, but Jessica waved her off with a smile. "You're our guest tonight. Just relax and enjoy yourself." Margaret watched as Jessica disappeared into the kitchen, noting how Diane and David exchanged a quick glance. The air seemed charged with anticipation, and Margaret prepared herself for whatever announcement was coming. When Jessica returned, she carried a tray with 4 perfect crème brûlées, their caramelized tops gleaming like golden mirrors. But it was what she carried in her other hand that made Margaret's breath catch: a bottle of champagne. "I thought we might have something special to celebrate," Jessica said, her voice slightly breathless with excitement. This was it, the moment they'd been building toward all evening. Margaret felt her heart rate quicken as David stood to help with the champagne, his hands slightly shaky as he peeled away the foil. The cork popped with a satisfying sound, and David poured the golden liquid into 4 flutes that Jessica had apparently retrieved from the kitchen. Margaret noticed that Jessica's flute contained significantly less champagne than the others. "Before we toast," Jessica said, her voice wavering slightly with emotion, "David and I have something we want to share with you both." Margaret held her breath, her eyes moving between her son and daughter-in-law. This was the moment she'd been anticipating all evening. "We're pregnant," David announced, his face breaking into the widest smile Margaret had ever seen. "Jessica is 10 weeks along. We wanted to wait until after the first trimester to tell anyone, but we couldn't keep it to ourselves any longer." The room erupted in excitement. Diane immediately stood and rushed to embrace Jessica, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so happy for you. This is the most wonderful news." Margaret felt her own eyes fill with tears as she rose to hug her son. "David, I'm so proud of you both. You're going to be wonderful parents." As she embraced Jessica, Margaret felt a surge of emotion. Joy, excitement, but also something deeper. This baby would be her first grandchild, a continuation of the family line that she and Robert had started so many years ago. "When are you due?" Margaret asked, accepting her champagne flute with trembling hands. "Early May," Jessica replied, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "Right around Mother's Day, which seems pretty perfect." "A spring baby," Diane said dreamily. "How absolutely perfect. And you're feeling well." "Better now," Jessica admitted. "The first few weeks were rough, but my doctor says everything looks great." As they raised their glasses in a toast, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. This evening had brought their small family closer together, and the promise of a new generation filled her with hope and excitement. But as she sipped her champagne and watched the happy couple, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something unspoken that hovered at the edges of this celebration. Perhaps it was just the overwhelming nature of such significant news. Or maybe it was the way Diane kept glancing at Jessica with an expression that seemed to contain more than just grandmother-to-be excitement. Whatever it was, Margaret decided to put it aside for now. Tonight was about celebration, about family, and about the new chapter that was beginning for all of them. As Jessica served the crème brûlée and the conversation turned to baby names and nursery plans, Margaret allowed herself to be swept up in the joy of the moment. The first chapter of this new family story was ending on a note of pure happiness, though she had no idea how complicated the next chapters would become. 3 weeks after the pregnancy announcement, Margaret found herself standing in the baby department of Target, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of choices before her. Strollers that cost more than her monthly grocery budget sat beside high-tech monitors that promised to track everything from a baby's breathing to room temperature. She'd come looking for a simple gift, perhaps a soft blanket or some basic onesies, but had instead discovered an entire industry built around new parent anxiety. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mum, Jessica wanted me to ask if you'd like to come to her first ultrasound appointment next Tuesday at 2 p.m. She thought you might want to see your grandchild for the first time." Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. This was exactly the kind of gesture she'd hoped for, being included in the important moments, becoming part of the fabric of this growing family. She quickly typed back, "I would love that. Thank you for thinking of me." She was still smiling when another text came through, this one from an unknown number. "Hi Margaret, this is Diane. I got your number from Jessica. I'm actually flying in Monday night for the ultrasound appointment." Jessica was so excited to have both grandmothers there, looking forward to seeing you. Margaret stared at the message, her initial excitement dimming slightly. She wasn't sure why, but she'd somehow assumed she would be the only grandmother at this appointment. It wasn't that she didn't want Diane there. Of course, a mother would want to be present for such a milestone. But something about the way the invitation had been extended through David rather than Jessica directly, and now learning that Diane would also be there, made Margaret feel less special, more like an afterthought. She shook off the feeling, reminding herself that this wasn't about her. This was about supporting Jessica and David and welcoming a new member into their family. If anything, having both grandmothers present would make the occasion even more meaningful. By Tuesday afternoon, Margaret had worked herself into a state of nervous excitement. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a soft blue cardigan that David had always complimented, paired with comfortable slacks and her good shoes. She'd even stopped at the florist to pick up a small bouquet of white roses for Jessica. The medical office was one of those modern facilities that looked more like a high-end spa than a traditional doctor's office. Soft music played from hidden speakers, and the waiting room featured comfortable seating arranged around a gas fireplace. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, as was her habit, and settled into a chair with a good view of the entrance. David and Jessica arrived precisely on time, Jessica looking radiant in a flowing dress that had clearly been chosen to accommodate her changing body. David held her hand as they approached the reception desk, his attentiveness evident in every gesture. Margaret was about to wave them over when she noticed Diane emerging from the elevator, looking effortlessly elegant in a designer coat that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. She carried a large gift bag from an upscale boutique and walked with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being noticed. "Jessica, darling," Diane called out, her voice carrying across the waiting room. "You look absolutely glowing." Margaret watched as Diane enveloped Jessica in an embrace that seemed to last longer than necessary, then turned to greet David with the kind of warm familiarity that spoke of a close relationship. It was only then that Diane seemed to notice Margaret sitting nearby. "Margaret, I didn't see you there," Diane said, though something in her tone suggested she had indeed seen her. "How lovely that we can share this special moment together." As they settled into the waiting area, Margaret noticed the subtle dynamics at play. Jessica sat between David and her mother, their conversation flowing easily as they discussed everything from morning sickness remedies to nursery color schemes. Margaret found herself positioned slightly outside their circle, contributing when spoken to, but not naturally included in the rapid-fire exchange of shared references and inside jokes. "I brought you something," Diane said, producing the gift bag with a flourish. "I know it's early, but I couldn't resist." Jessica opened the bag to reveal an exquisite baby blanket made from what looked like the softest cashmere Margaret had ever seen. The craftsmanship was clearly expensive, with delicate embroidery along the border that must have taken hours to complete. "Mom, it's beautiful," Jessica said, tears forming in her eyes. "This must have cost a fortune." "Nothing's too good for my first grandchild," Diane replied, though her eyes flickered briefly toward Margaret as she said it. Margaret felt the white roses in her lap suddenly seem inadequate. She'd spent $20 on flowers that would be wilted and forgotten within a week, while Diane had brought an heirloom-quality gift that would be treasured for years to come. "These are lovely, Margaret," Jessica said, noticing the flowers for the first time. "Thank you for thinking of me." Before Margaret could respond, a nurse appeared to call them back for the appointment. As they walked down the hallway, Margaret found herself trailing behind the group, watching how Diane's hand rested protectively on Jessica's shoulder while David held his wife's other hand. The ultrasound room was larger than Margaret had expected, with a comfortable chair positioned for viewing the monitor. Dr. Patricia Weinstein, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands, greeted them warmly. "So we have the whole family here today," Dr. Weinstein observed as she prepared the equipment. "How wonderful. First babies are always special, but having this much love and support makes it even better." Jessica settled onto the examination table, while David positioned himself at her side. Diane claimed the viewing chair with practiced ease, leaving Margaret to stand slightly behind and to the side, where she had to crane her neck to see the monitor clearly. As Dr. Weinstein applied the gel and began moving the ultrasound wand across Jessica's abdomen. The room fell silent with anticipation. For several moments, the screen showed nothing but grey static and shadowy forms that meant nothing to Margaret's untrained eye. Then, suddenly, there it was. A tiny form that was unmistakably human, complete with a perfectly formed head, tiny arms, and legs that seemed to be moving in a slow-motion dance. "There's your baby," Dr. Weinstein said softly. "Everything looks perfect. Would you like to hear the heartbeat?" The sound that filled the room was like nothing Margaret had ever heard. A rapid, strong rhythm that seemed to echo with the promise of life itself. She felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched her son's face transform with wonder and joy. "Oh my God," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's really our baby." Jessica was crying openly now, and Diane had moved to the other side of the examination table, holding her daughter's hand while speaking in soft, soothing tones that Margaret couldn't quite make out. Margaret remained where she was, feeling simultaneously included and excluded from this intimate family moment. She was witnessing the first glimpse of her grandchild, a moment she would treasure forever, but she was experiencing it from the periphery, like an observer rather than a participant. "Would you like some pictures?" Dr. Weinstein asked, and the enthusiasm of the response was immediate and unanimous. As the doctor printed multiple copies of the ultrasound images, Margaret found herself wondering if she would receive one. Diane was already discussing which picture she wanted to frame for her office, and David was talking about sending copies to his college friends. "Margaret, would you like one of these?" Jessica asked, noticing her standing quietly in the corner. "I would love that," Margaret replied, accepting the black and white image with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you for including me in this." As they prepared to leave the medical office, Margaret overheard Diane suggesting that they all go to lunch to celebrate. "There's that lovely new bistro downtown," she was saying to Jessica. "We could make an afternoon of it." Margaret was about to express her enthusiasm for the idea when she heard Jessica's response. "That sounds wonderful, Mom. I've been craving their salmon salad all week." The casual way Jessica had agreed, without even glancing in Margaret's direction, made it clear that the lunch invitation wasn't intended to include her. Margaret felt a familiar sensation, the same feeling she'd had at family gatherings, where conversations flowed around her without quite including her. "I should probably head home," Margaret said, forcing brightness into her voice. "I have some errands to run this afternoon." "Are you sure?" David asked, though his tone suggested he was relieved rather than disappointed. "We could drop you off somewhere." No, Margaret assured him. "I have my car. You young people enjoy your lunch. Thank you again for including me today. It was truly special." As she walked to her car, Margaret could hear their voices behind her, already deep in animated conversation about baby names and nursery themes. The ultrasound picture felt warm in her hands, but the joy of the moment was tempered by a growing awareness of her place in this expanding family dynamic. The drive home gave Margaret time to process what she'd observed. It wasn't that anyone had been deliberately unkind or exclusionary. David and Jessica were clearly committed to including her in important moments. But there was a natural ease between Jessica and her mother that Margaret couldn't compete with, a shorthand of shared experiences and mutual understanding that made Margaret feel like an outsider trying to break into an established group. That evening, as Margaret framed the ultrasound picture for her mantelpiece, she reflected on the differences between herself and Diane. Where Diane was cosmopolitan and well-traveled, Margaret lived a quieter life in her modest apartment. Where Diane could afford expensive gifts and spontaneous lunch plans, Margaret lived on a fixed income and planned her purchases carefully. Where Diane moved through the world with confident ease, Margaret often felt uncertain about how to navigate the social complexities of modern family relationships. It wasn't jealousy exactly. Margaret genuinely wanted Jessica to have a close relationship with her mother, but she couldn't help wondering where she fit into this picture, what role she was supposed to play in. her grandchild's life. Her phone rang just as she was settling in for the evening, interrupting her brooding thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to call and thank you for coming today. It meant so much to Jessica and me to have you there." "It was my pleasure, sweetheart. Seeing that little one for the first time. I'll never forget it. Jessica wanted me to tell you that she's going to start looking at nursery furniture this weekend. She was wondering if you'd like to come along. She values your opinion on these things." Margaret felt her spirits lift considerably. "I would love that. What time were you thinking?" "Saturday morning, probably around 10. We're going to that big baby store in Bloomington. Diane's flying back to Chicago Friday night, so it would just be the three of us." After they hung up, Margaret felt cautiously optimistic. Perhaps she'd been reading too much into the social dynamics she'd observed. Jessica was making an effort to include her, and that was what mattered. But as the week progressed, small incidents began to accumulate that suggested the situation was more complex than Margaret wanted to believe. When she called to confirm Saturday's shopping trip, Jessica seemed distracted and mentioned that she'd already ordered several items online to save time. Indeed, when Margaret offered to host a small baby shower for Jessica's friends, the response was polite but lukewarm, with Jessica mentioning that her mother was already planning something more elaborate in Chicago. Most telling was the conversation Margaret overheard when she called David's house on Thursday evening. She could hear Jessica's voice in the background, though not the words, and David's responses. "I know, honey, but she means well. Yes, I'll talk to her about it. No, of course we want her involved, but maybe we need to be more specific about how..." Margaret hung up before David could answer, her heart sinking as she realized they'd been discussing her. The conversation suggested that her attempts at involvement were being seen as intrusive rather than helpful, that there were family discussions happening about how to manage her expectations and participation. By Friday evening, Margaret had worked herself into a state of anxious uncertainty. She wanted to be a loving, supportive grandmother without overstepping boundaries she didn't fully understand. But navigating the complex dynamics between herself, Jessica, and Diane felt like walking through a minefield where every step could potentially cause offense. The upcoming shopping trip would be a test, Margaret realized. It would give her a chance to observe how Jessica really felt about including her in important decisions, and whether the invitation had been genuine or merely a impolite gesture extended out of obligation. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret found herself staring at the ultrasound picture on her nightstand. That tiny form represented so much hope and possibility, but also so much uncertainty about her own future role in this child's life. The second chapter of this family story was ending with more questions than answers, and Margaret was beginning to understand that the road ahead would require more grace, patience, and wisdom than she'd initially realized. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Minnesota October day that hinted at the long winter ahead. Margaret had been awake since 5:30, her stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and anxiety about the nursery shopping expedition. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, comfortable shoes for walking, a warm sweater, and her good purse, the one David had given her for Mother's Day 2 years ago. As she drove through the suburban streets toward David and Jessica's house, Margaret rehearsed potential conversations in her head. She wanted to be helpful but not pushy, interested but not overwhelming. The overheard phone conversation from earlier in the week had left her acutely aware that her behavior was being scrutinized and discussed. The colonial house looked welcoming in the morning light, despite the overcast sky. Mums in fall colors flanked the front steps, and a small pumpkin display added seasonal charm to the entrance. Margaret could see David's car in the driveway, but no sign of Diane's rental car, confirming that Jessica's mother had indeed returned to Chicago the night before. David answered the door before Margaret could knock, his hair still damp from a shower and a coffee mug in his hand. "Morning, Mum." "Perfect timing. Jess is just finishing her breakfast. How is she feeling?" Margaret asked as she stepped into the warm foyer. "I know the first trimester can be challenging. Much better, actually. The morning sickness seems to be easing up, and she's got her energy back. She's been looking forward to today all week." Margaret felt a surge of relief. Perhaps her concerns about being unwanted or intrusive had been unfounded. Maybe Jessica really did value her input and want to share this experience with her. Jessica appeared from the kitchen, looking fresh and radiant in dark jeans and a soft pink sweater that emphasized her growing curves. At 13 weeks pregnant, she was just beginning to show, and Margaret thought she had never looked more beautiful. "Margaret, good morning," Jessica said, offering a warm smile and a brief hug. "I hope you don't mind, but I made us a list of things to look at. I've been researching cribs and car seats online, and there's so much to consider." "I think that's very smart," Margaret replied. "I remember feeling completely overwhelmed when I was shopping for David's nursery. Having a plan will make everything much easier." As they gathered their coats and purses, Margaret noticed that Jessica carried a thick folder filled with printed articles, product reviews, and what looked like a detailed spreadsheet. The level of organization was impressive, if somewhat intimidating. The drive to the baby superstore took about 20 minutes, during which Margaret listened to David and Jessica discuss everything from stroller specifications to the safety ratings of various car seat brands. Their conversation was peppered with technical terms and brand names that meant nothing to Margaret, who had purchased David's baby equipment from the local department store 32 years ago. "I've been reading about sleep training methods," Jessica was saying as they pulled into the massive parking lot. "Diane sent me several books on infant development, and there are so many different approaches to consider." Margaret noticed the easy way Jessica referred to her mother's advice and how David nodded along as if Diane's recommendations carried significant weight in their decision-making process. It was a small thing, but it reinforced Margaret's growing awareness of the different levels of influence and involvement in this family. The baby store was unlike anything Margaret had experienced during her own pregnancy. The entrance featured a display of strollers that looked more like spacecraft than baby carriages, complete with digital displays and more moving parts than her first car. Price tags revealed costs that made Margaret's eyes widen with disbelief. "Where should we start?" David asked, consulting Jessica's list. "Cribs, I think," Jessica replied. "I've narrowed it down to 3 models, but I want to see them in person before making a decision." As they made their way through the store, Margaret felt increasingly out of her depth. Sales associates spoke in a language of technical specifications and safety ratings that seemed designed to make parents feel inadequate if they didn't purchase the most expensive option available. The crib section resembled a furniture showroom, with dozens of models ranging from simple white designs to elaborate convertible systems that transformed into toddler beds, then full-size beds, and apparently everything but a college dormitory. "This is the one I've been considering," Jessica said, stopping in front of a sleek modern crib with clean lines and a price tag that made Margaret quietly gasp. "It's made from sustainable hardwood, has the highest safety ratings, and converts into a full-size bed when the baby outgrows it." Margaret examined the crib carefully, running her hands along the smooth rails and admiring the craftsmanship. It was undeniably beautiful, though she couldn't help comparing it to the simple white crib she'd used for David, which had served its purpose perfectly well for a fraction of the cost. "It's lovely," Margaret said diplomatically. "Very well made. Diane thinks it's perfect," Jessica continued. "She said she wishes they'd had options like this when I was a baby. She's actually offered to pay for it as her gift to the baby." Udi. There it was again. Diane's opinion carrying weight. Diane's generosity setting a standard that Margaret couldn't match. Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation of being outclassed by someone with deeper pockets and stronger influence. "That's very generous of her," Margaret managed to say, and she meant it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that every conversation seemed to circle back to what Diane thought, what Diane recommended, what Diane was contributing. As they Moved through the store, this pattern continued. The stroller Jessica favored was one that Diane had recommended after extensive research. The car seat on their list was the same model that Diane's real estate colleague swore by for her own grandchildren. Even the baby monitor system Jessica wanted to purchase had been suggested by Diane after she'd read about it in some parenting magazine. Margaret found herself nodding and agreeing, offering generic praise for each item while feeling increasingly like a supporting character in someone else's story. When she tentatively suggested looking at a beautiful rocking chair that reminded her of the one her own mother had used, Jessica politely examined it before explaining that Diane had already found the perfect glider at an exclusive boutique in Chicago. It's being custom upholstered in fabric that matches the nursery theme, Jessica explained. Mom has such an eye for design. It was while they were examining changing tables that Margaret finally found an opportunity to contribute something meaningful to the conversation. Jessica was comparing two models, both priced beyond what Margaret considered reasonable, when Margaret noticed a third option tucked away in a corner display. "What about this one?" Margaret suggested, approaching a solid wood-changing table with clean lines and practical storage. "It seems well built, and the price is much more reasonable." Jessica followed her over and examined the piece. Carefully. For the first time all morning, she seemed genuinely interested in Margaret's suggestion. "This is actually very nice," Jessica admitted, running her hands along the smooth surface. "The wood quality is excellent, and I like the storage configuration." David joined them, and Margaret felt a small surge of pride as he nodded approvingly. "This is really solid construction, Jess, and look at all this storage space." For a few minutes, Margaret felt like she was actually contributing to the process rather than just observing it. Jessica asked detailed questions about the changing table's features, and Margaret found herself drawing on her experience as a teacher to discuss the practical considerations of diaper changing and baby care. But the moment was short-lived. As Jessica was seriously considering the piece, her phone buzzed with a text message. Margaret watched as Jessica's expression changed while she read the message. "It's Mom," Jessica said to David. "She found another changing table online that she wants me to look at. She's sending me the link now." Margaret felt her enthusiasm deflate as Jessica became absorbed in her phone, scrolling through what was apparently a detailed product description and photo gallery. David leaned over his wife's shoulder to look at the screen, and Margaret found herself once again relegated to the sidelines. "This is gorgeous," David said, studying the phone. "Much more sophisticated than anything we've seen here. And Mom says it's part of a complete nursery collection," Jessica added excitedly. "We could coordinate everything perfectly." Margaret looked at the changing table she'd suggested, which suddenly seemed plain and unremarkable compared to whatever elegant piece Diane had discovered. She felt foolish for thinking her input could compete with Diane's apparently superior taste and resources. As they moved on to look at other items, Margaret's contributions became increasingly tentative. When Jessica asked for her opinion on baby bedding, Margaret found herself saying things like, "Whatever you think is best, and you have such good taste." The enthusiasm she'd felt about sharing this experience had been replaced by a growing sense of inadequacy. The breaking point came in the feeding section, where they were examining high chairs. Jessica had been considering several options when she stopped at an expensive model with numerous adjustment features and electronic components. "This is the one Diane thinks we should get," Jessica said. "She sent me all the research about why this particular design is superior for infant development." Margaret looked at the high chair, which resembled something from a NASA laboratory more than a simple baby feeding device. The price tag was astronomical, and she couldn't help thinking about the simple wooden high chair that David had used, the same one her father had built with his own hands for Margaret when she was a baby. "What do you think, Margaret?" Jessica asked, though her tone suggested the decision had already been made. Margaret stared at the high chair, then at Jessica's expectant face, then at David, who was reading the product specifications with apparent fascination. Something inside her finally snapped. "Honestly," Margaret said, her voice carrying more edge than she'd intended, "I think it's ridiculous to spend $800 on a chair that a baby will use for maybe 2 years. David ate in a wooden high chair that cost my father $15 in materials, and he turned out just fine." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica's eyes widened with surprise, while David looked uncomfortable and began fidgeting with his phone. "I mean," Margaret continued, the dam of her frustration finally bursting, "when did feeding a baby become so complicated? When did every single decision require extensive research and premium pricing? Babies have been eating in high chairs for generations without needing electronic monitoring and space-age materials." Jessica's face had gone pale, and Margaret immediately regretted her outburst. This wasn't about the high chair, and she knew it. This was about feeling marginalized and unnecessary, about watching Diane's influence shape every decision while her own contributions were politely tolerated at best. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quickly. "I didn't mean to criticize your choices. You should get whatever makes you feel comfortable and confident." But the damage was done. The easy atmosphere of the morning had evaporated, replaced by an awkward tension that seemed to follow them through the rest of the store. Jessica's questions became more perfunctory, and David kept glancing at his watch as if looking for an excuse to leave. When they finally headed to the checkout area, Margaret felt exhausted by the effort of trying to repair the mood she'd damaged. Jessica had selected several items, not including the changing table Margaret had suggested, and arranged for delivery to their home. The drive back was largely silent, with Jessica staring out the window and David making forced conversation about traffic and weather. Margaret sat in the back seat, replaying her outburst and wishing she could take back the words that had revealed too much about her growing resentment. As they pulled into David and Jessica's driveway, Margaret made a decision that she knew was probably cowardly, but felt necessary for everyone's comfort. "I think I'll head home," she announced, before anyone could suggest coming inside. "I have some things to take care of this afternoon." "Are you sure?" David asked, though his relief was evident. "We were going to order lunch and maybe look at paint colors for the nursery." "Another time," Margaret said firmly. "Thank you for including me today. I hope you'll be very happy with everything you selected." As she drove home, Margaret's mind churned with conflicting emotions. She was ashamed of her outburst, but also frustrated by what felt like a morning spent watching other people make decisions while she played the role of supportive audience member. She loved Jessica and wanted to be part of this experience, but she was beginning to understand that wanting something and being welcomed into it were two different things. Her small apartment felt quiet and lonely after the bustle of the baby store. Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat in her favorite chair, looking at the ultrasound picture on her side table. That tiny form represented her grandchild, her connection to the future, but today had made her wonder what kind of relationship she would actually have with this new member of the family. The phone rang just as she was settling into her brooding thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen, and Margaret braced herself for what she assumed would be a difficult conversation about her behavior. "Hi, Mom," David said, his voice carefully neutral. "I just wanted to make sure you got home safely." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Thank you for checking." There was a pause that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Margaret could hear Jessica's voice in the background, though not the words, and she imagined they were discussing how to handle her obvious unhappiness. "Mom," David finally said, "is everything okay? You seemed upset today, and Jessica is worried that she did something wrong." Margaret felt a stab of guilt. Of course, Jessica would blame herself rather than recognizing the deeper issues at play. That was exactly the kind of thoughtful response that made it impossible to dislike her daughter-in-law, even when feeling pushed aside by her. "Tell Jessica she did nothing wrong," Margaret said firmly. "She was lovely today, as always. I think I'm just adjusting to all the changes, and sometimes I don't handle it as gracefully as I should. We want you to be part of this, Mom. You know that, right?" Margaret looked again at the ultrasound picture, that small black and white image that represented so much hope and uncertainty. "I know you do, David, and I want to be part of it too," I just need to figure out how to do that without... She paused, searching for the right words, without getting in the way. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the growing darkness of late afternoon, processing the day's events and her own complicated emotions. She wasn't proud of her behavior, but she was beginning to understand that her role in this expanding family would require more thoughtfulness and restraint than she'd initially realized. The third chapter of this story was ending with hard-won insights about family dynamics, generational differences, and the challenge of finding one's place in relationships that were still being defined. Margaret knew that the path forward would require more grace and wisdom than she'd shown today, but she was determined to learn from her mistakes and find a way to be the grandmother she wanted to be. Supportive, loving, and appropriately involved without being intrusive or competitive. As she prepared dinner for one in her quiet kitchen, Margaret made a mental note to call Jessica tomorrow and apologize properly for her outburst. Building relationships took time and patience, and she was willing to invest both in creating a positive dynamic with her daughter-in-law and securing her place in her grandchild's life. The shopping trip had been a revelation, but perhaps not the kind she'd expected. Instead of bonding over baby furniture, she'd learned important lessons about boundaries, expectations, and the delicate balance required to navigate complex family relationships. It wasn't the outcome she'd hoped for, but it was knowledge she could use going forward. 2 months had passed since the shopping expedition, and Margaret had made a conscious effort to recalibrate her approach to family relationships. She'd apologized to Jessica for her outburst, received a gracious and understanding response, and had been working to find ways to be supportive without being overwhelming. The holiday season was approaching, and with it, the promise of new opportunities to strengthen family bonds. Jessica was now 21, weeks pregnant, her bump clearly visible and her energy restored. The nursery was taking shape, featuring the expensive items that Diane had helped select, along with a few more budget-friendly pieces that Margaret had quietly gifted when she found them on sale. The relationship between the two women had remained cordial, if somewhat cautious, but Margaret felt they were making progress. It was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving when Margaret received the call that would set everything in motion. "Mom!" David's voice was excited but slightly nervous. "Jessica and I have been talking, and we'd love to host Thanksgiving dinner this year. It would be our first time entertaining as a family, and with the baby coming, we thought it would be nice to start some new traditions." Margaret felt a warm glow of anticipation. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. What can I bring? I could make my apple pie or that green bean casserole you've always loved." Actually, Jessica has been planning the menu for weeks. She's really excited to try out some new recipes, but we'd love to have you here around 2 o'clock, if that works. As they discussed the details, Margaret learned that the guest list would be small and intimate: herself, David and Jessica, and Diane, who was flying in from Chicago for the long weekend. Margaret felt a familiar flutter of nervousness at the prospect of spending an extended period with Diane, but she was determined to approach the occasion with grace and positivity. The week leading up to Thanksgiving passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret selected her outfit carefully, a burgundy dress that complemented her coloring and made her feel confident. She purchased a beautiful bouquet of fall flowers as a hostess gift and spent considerable time selecting a bottle of wine that would pair well with turkey dinner without breaking her modest budget. Thursday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made Minneapolis look like a postcard. Margaret spent the morning preparing herself mentally for the gathering, reminding herself to be supportive, interested, and gracious, no matter what dynamics might emerge. She arrived at David and Jessica's house promptly at 2 o'clock, her arms full of flowers and wine, her heart full of hope for a lovely family celebration. The house looked spectacular, with autumn decorations adorning every surface and the scent of roasting turkey filling the air. David answered the door wearing an apron over his good clothes, his face flushed from the heat of the kitchen. "Mom, perfect timing. Come in, come in." Jessica's been cooking since dawn, and everything smells incredible. The dining room had been transformed into something from a magazine spread. The table was set with Jessica's grandmother's china, crystal glasses caught the afternoon light, and a centerpiece of gourds and autumn leaves created an elegant focal point. Cloth napkins were arranged in elaborate folds, and small place cards indicated where each person should sit. Margaret noticed that the place cards positioned her at one end of the table, with David to her right and an empty chair to her left that she assumed was meant for Diane. Jessica would sit at the opposite end with her mother beside her. "Jessica, this is absolutely beautiful," Margaret said as her daughter-in-law emerged from the kitchen looking radiant, despite what must have been hours of preparation. "You've outdone yourself." "Thank you," Jessica replied, accepting Margaret's hug and flowers with a bright smile. "I wanted everything to be perfect for our first Thanksgiving as hosts. Mom should be here any minute. Her flight landed an hour ago." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Diane appeared at the front door, looking effortlessly elegant despite having just traveled. She carried what appeared to be a wine bottle wrapped in expensive paper, along with a small gift bag that made Margaret's modest bouquet seem insufficient by comparison. "Darling," Diane called out, embracing Jessica with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for long-awaited reunions, though they'd spoken on the phone just the day before. "You look absolutely radiant. Pregnancy suits you beautifully." As the greetings continued, Margaret observed the easy familiarity between Diane and the young couple. There were inside jokes about Jessica's cooking experiments, references to shared phone conversations, and the kind of comfortable shorthand that spoke of frequent, meaningful communication. "I brought that wine we talked about," Diane said to Jessica, producing the wrapped bottle, "and a little something for my grandchild." The gift bag contained an exquisite baby outfit in soft yellow, suitable for either gender, made from what looked like the finest organic cotton. The craftsmanship was clearly expensive, and Margaret couldn't help but notice the designer label sewn discreetly into the seam. "Mom, it's gorgeous," Jessica said, holding up the tiny outfit with obvious delight. "This will be perfect for the baby's first professional photos." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest as she watched this exchange. She'd brought flowers for the hostess, as etiquette dictated, but Diane had brought gifts that demonstrated her ongoing investment in the pregnancy and her future grandchild. Once again, Margaret felt like she was playing by different rules than everyone else. As they settled in the living room with pre-dinner drinks, the conversation naturally turned to the pregnancy and birth preparation. Jessica was full of updates about doctor appointments, childbirth classes, and nursery progress, all of which she shared with the kind of detail that suggested these topics had been extensively discussed with Diane already. "The birthing center tour was amazing," Jessica was saying. "Mom, you would love how modern and comfortable everything is. Nothing like the sterile hospital rooms from our generation." "I've been reading about birthing centers," Diane replied knowledgeably. "The research on maternal satisfaction and birth outcomes is quite compelling. I'm so proud of you for taking such an informed approach to this experience." Margaret listened to this exchange with growing awareness that she was hearing about these developments for the first time, while Diane was clearly already well-versed in Jessica's birth plan and preferences. It wasn't that she expected to know every detail, but the easy familiarity between mother and daughter highlighted her own position as secondary recipient of information. "Have you thought about who you'd like in the delivery room?" Diane asked, and Margaret felt herself tense slightly. This was exactly the kind of question that could reveal uncomfortable truths about family hierarchies and expectations. "Well, David, of course," Jessica replied, reaching for her husband's hand. "And Mom, I was hoping you'd be there too. I know it's a lot to ask, but having you there would mean everything to me." Margaret felt her heart sink, even as she tried to maintain a pleasant expression. It wasn't that she'd expected to be invited into the delivery room. That was a decision for Jessica to make. But hearing the invitation extended so naturally to Diane, without even a mention of whether Margaret might be included, made her feel definitively categorized as extended family rather than immediate support system. "Of course, darling," Diane replied, squeezing Jessica's hand. "I wouldn't miss it for anything. We'll get through this together." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Margaret found herself only half listening, processing the implications of what she'd just heard. When the baby was born, Diane would be in the delivery room, sharing that momentous first moment, while Margaret would presumably be in the waiting room with other relatives and friends, receiving updates secondhand. It was as they were moving to the dinner table that Margaret decided to focus on enjoying the meal and celebrating the occasion, rather than dwelling on family dynamics she couldn't control. The food was indeed spectacular. Jessica had clearly invested considerable time and effort in creating a memorable feast. The turkey was perfectly golden and moist, the side dishes were restaurant quality, and the presentation was flawless. Margaret made sure to compliment each dish and express genuine appreciation for Jessica's obvious talent and hard work. "This stuffing is incredible, Jessica," Margaret said, savoring a particularly flavorful bite. "What's your secret?" "It's actually my grandmother's recipe," Jessica replied. "Mum helped me track down the original version from her old recipe box. We spent hours on the phone last weekend, going through the measurements and techniques." There it was again, another reminder of the collaborative relationship between Jessica and Diane. Another example of shared history and ongoing communication that Margaret wasn't part of. Even Jessica's cooking success was somehow connected to Diane's involvement and support. As the meal progressed, Margaret found herself paying closer attention to the subtle dynamics playing out around the table. When Jessica mentioned feeling overwhelmed by all the baby-related decisions, it was Diane who offered specific, knowledgeable advice. When David talked about his concerns about becoming a father, it was Diane who shared reassuring anecdotes about her own experiences. When the conversation turned to holiday plans, it was Diane whose schedule and preferences seemed to take priority in the planning process. Margaret contributed when spoken to, offered appropriate comments and questions, and maintained the pleasant, supportive demeanor she'd been cultivating since the shopping trip incident. But she couldn't shake the growing awareness that she was witnessing a family dynamic where she played a supporting role rather than a central one. It was during dessert, Jessica's homemade pumpkin pie with fresh whipped cream, that the moment occurred that would crystallize everything Margaret had been feeling and observing. David had gone to the kitchen to start coffee, leaving the three women alone at the table. Diane was praising Jessica's pie-making skills when Jessica suddenly winced and put her hand to her lower back. "Oh," Jessica said softly, shifting in her chair, "I think I overdid it today. My back is really bothering me." "You've been on your feet for hours," Diane said with immediate concern. "Here, let me get you something for that." Diane rose from the table and disappeared into the kitchen, returning a moment later with a glass of water and what appeared to be a tablet in her palm. "Take this," Diane said, offering the medication to Jessica. "It's safe for pregnancy, and it'll help with the inflammation." Margaret watched this exchange with growing alarm. Diane was offering medication to a pregnant woman without knowing what other drugs Jessica might be taking, without consulting with David, and without any apparent hesitation about the appropriateness of her intervention. But what happened next was what truly shocked Margaret. Jessica accepted the tablet without question, swallowed it with the water, and thanked her mother with genuine gratitude. "Thanks, Mom. You always know how to take care of me." The casual ease of this interaction, Diane offering medication, Jessica accepting it without hesitation, revealed a level of intimacy and trust that Margaret found both surprising and troubling. It wasn't her place to interfere with medical decisions, but she couldn't help feeling that pregnant women should consult with their doctors, or at least their husbands, before taking medication, even over-the-counter pain relievers. As David returned with the coffee service, Diane leaned over and whispered something to Jessica that Margaret couldn't quite hear, but Jessica's response was clear enough. "Oh, "Oh, that drink's for her," she said, gesturing subtly in Margaret's direction. Margaret looked at the coffee cup David was preparing to hand to Jessica, then at Jessica's meaningful glance toward her, and suddenly understood. Jessica wanted Margaret to have the caffeinated coffee instead of her, presumably because pregnant women were supposed to limit their caffeine intake. Without really thinking about it, Margaret reached out and intercepted the coffee cup David was about to give Jessica, handing it instead to Diane, who was sitting closest to her. "Here you go, Diane," Margaret said pleasantly. "This looks perfect." The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Jessica's face went pale. Diane looked confused, and David froze with the coffee pot still in his hand. "Mom," David said carefully, "I think Jessica was trying to tell you that the regular coffee was meant for you. She's been drinking decaf since the pregnancy." Margaret looked around the table, taking in the expressions of confusion and something that looked almost like pity. She realized that Jessica's whispered comment had been intended to ensure that Margaret received the caffeinated coffee, not that Jessica should avoid it. But in that moment, something crystallized for Margaret. The medication offered without consultation, the casual way Diane took charge of Jessica's comfort, the whispered communication that excluded Margaret from the loop. It all represented a dynamic that had been building for months. "Actually," Margaret said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that surprised even her, "I think it's interesting how easily we make assumptions about what pregnant women should and shouldn't have." She looked directly at Diane, who was still holding the coffee cup with obvious confusion. "For instance," Margaret continued, "I noticed you gave Jessica medication without asking David, without checking what other medications she might be taking, and without consulting her doctor. When I was pregnant, we were much more cautious about putting anything into our bodies that hadn't been specifically approved by our physicians." The silence that followed was deafening. Diane's face flushed red, Jessica looked mortified, and David appeared to be struggling with how to respond to his mother's unprecedented directness. "It was just ibuprofen," Diane said defensively. "Perfectly safe for pregnancy." "Actually," Margaret replied, her voice still calm but firm, "ibuprofen is specifically not recommended during pregnancy, especially in the third trimester. It can cause complications with fetal development and labor." The truth was, Margaret wasn't entirely certain about the specifics of ibuprofen and pregnancy, but years of teaching had given her a healthy respect for research and accuracy, and Diane's casual confidence had struck her as potentially dangerous. Jessica had gone very quiet, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. David set down the coffee pot and moved to his wife's side. "Jess, are you okay? Do we need to call Dr. Weinstein?" I don't know," Jessica said quietly. "I didn't think to ask. Mom said it was safe." The shift in the room was palpable. Suddenly, Diane's confident intervention looked less like caring support and more like potentially harmful overreach. Jessica's automatic trust in her mother's medical advice seemed naive rather than touching, and Margaret's interruption of the coffee service looked less like confusion and more like protective instinct. "I think we should call the doctor," Margaret said gently, looking at Jessica with genuine concern. "Just to be safe. Better to check these things than worry about them." David was already reaching for his phone, and Jessica nodded gratefully. As David stepped away to make the call, an uncomfortable silence settled over the dining room. Diane looked both embarrassed and defensive, clearly struggling with the realization that her well-intentioned action might have been inappropriate. Jessica appeared shaken by the possibility that she'd made a dangerous choice, and Margaret felt a complex mix of vindication and regret, satisfaction at finally asserting herself, but sadness that it had taken a potentially harmful situation to do so. "The nurse said it should be fine," David reported when he returned from his phone call, "but she wants Jessica to drink plenty of water and call if she experiences any unusual symptoms. She also said, Margaret is right about avoiding ibuprofen during pregnancy." The rest of the evening passed in subdued conversation, with the earlier festive mood replaced by a more thoughtful atmosphere. When Diane announced that she was tired from traveling and would turn in early, no one protested. When Margaret said she should head home to avoid driving too late, David and Jessica walked her to the door with more warmth than they'd shown all evening. "Thank you, Mom," David said quietly as he helped her with her coat. "For speaking up. I should have been paying closer attention." Jessica stepped forward and gave Margaret a hug that felt more genuine than any they'd shared in months. "I'm sorry I don't know, maybe not including you enough in things. Mom means well, but sometimes I forget that you have wisdom and experience that I should be listening to, too." As Margaret drove home through the quiet Thanksgiving evening streets, she reflected on the evening's events. The dinner had indeed changed everything, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of a pleasant family celebration, it had become a moment of reckoning about family dynamics, trust, and the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. The fourth and final chapter of this story was ending with hard-won insights about the courage required to challenge established patterns, the importance of protecting vulnerable family members, and the possibility that asserting oneself, even in uncomfortable ways, could ultimately strengthen rather than damage family relationships. Margaret knew that the path forward would still require delicacy and wisdom, but she also knew that she'd found her voice as a grandmother and family member. She'd learned that being supportive didn't mean being silent, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is speak truth, even when it's difficult to hear. The future of this family would be built on more honest communication, clearer boundaries, and a better understanding of everyone's role in protecting and nurturing the new life that was coming. It wasn't the Thanksgiving any of them had planned, but it might have been exactly the Thanksgiving they all needed. Epilogue: New Beginnings. 6 months later, Margaret sat in the comfortable rocking chair in her grandson's nursery, holding 5-week-old William David Chen in her arms. The morning sun streamed through the gauze curtains that Jessica had selected, not the expensive ones Diane had suggested, but a compromise that reflected both women's input in the final decision. The delivery had gone smoothly, with both grandmothers present as planned, but the dynamics had been different than anyone had expected. When Jessica had gone into labor, it was Margaret whom she'd asked to hold her hand during the most difficult contractions, and it was Margaret's calm presence that had provided the steadiness Jessica needed. Diane had been there too, offering love and support, but stepping back to allow Margaret to take the lead when it became clear that Jessica needed something different than what her mother's anxious energy could provide. The baby was perfect, healthy, alert, and already showing signs of the Chen family's distinctive dark eyes. As Margaret rocked him gently, she marveled at how much had changed since that pivotal Thanksgiving dinner. The medication incident had indeed been a turning point, but not in the dramatic way Margaret had feared it might be. Instead, it had opened conversations about boundaries, communication, and the importance of including multiple perspectives in important decisions. Jessica had become more intentional about seeking Margaret's advice, especially on practical matters related to childcare and development. David had become more assertive about protecting his wife and child from well-meaning but potentially overwhelming input from either grandmother. And Diane had gradually learned to offer suggestions rather than directives, asking questions rather than providing automatic answers. Most importantly, Margaret had learned to trust her instincts and speak up when something felt wrong, while also recognizing that her role was to support and guide rather than control or compete. The whispered comment that had started everything, "That drink's for her," had become a family joke, a reminder about the importance of clear communication and the dangers of making assumptions. But it had also become a symbol of how small misunderstandings could reveal larger truths about family relationships and the need for honest conversation. As William stirred in her arms, Margaret smiled down at his peaceful face. This little one would grow up in a family that had learned to navigate its complexities with greater wisdom and understanding. he would have two grandmothers who had found ways to love him without competing with each other, parents who had learned to set healthy boundaries while remaining open to support, and a family story that proved that even difficult conversations could lead to stronger relationships. Margaret began to hum softly, the same lullaby she'd sung to David 32 years ago, the same one her own mother had sung to her. Some traditions were worth preserving exactly as they were, while others needed to evolve with time and wisdom. Outside the nursery window, the spring morning was full of promise, just like the small life in her arms and the family relationships that had been tested, challenged, and ultimately strengthened by the courage to speak truth in love. The story that had begun with a whispered comment and a misunderstood gesture had become a testament to the power of honest communication, protective instincts, and the unbreakable bonds that hold families together through both conflict and joy. William David Chen would grow up knowing that he was loved fiercely by multiple generations, each offering their own gifts of wisdom, support, and protection. And Margaret would continue to be not just a grandmother, but a vital and valued member of this evolving family, her voice heard and her contributions cherished. As she rocked her grandson in the morning light, Margaret reflected on how the most meaningful family stories often began with moments of misunderstanding that led to greater clarity, and how the courage to challenge the status quo could ultimately create space for deeper love and more authentic relationships. The whispered comment that had changed everything had led them all to this moment. A new generation, cradled in arms, that had learned to reach out with both strength and gentleness, in a family that had discovered how to honor both tradition and growth.